Welcome everyone to Thoughtexchange Leader Discussion Live. We're going to be talking today about moving from competent to compassionate leadership with Dr. Quintin Shepherd, Superintendent of Schools from Victoria Independent School District. Before we get started today though, I just want to remind you to join the conversation on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on any social media. Let's extend this conversation outside of here. So if you do that, let's use these hashtags, hashtag TE virtual events, or hashtag TEVE. I like to say this is must see TEVE. So use those hashtags, or if you want, you can, I encourage you to use the chat box during the conversation. You know, let us know where you're from, let us know what organization you're with, talk to us about thoughts and questions as they come up, and then when we do the exchange, you can of course put them in there too. So if you're joining the conversation on social media, please use these hashtags. Okay, so now, I want to introduce you to Quintin Shepherd. So Dr. Quintin Shepherd is the Superintendent of Victoria Independent School District. He began his career in education teaching music at Cambridge Community Unity School District in Cambridge, Illinois. He served as principal at Amboy High and elementary schools before moving into the superintendent role at Amboy Community School District and then District 69 in Skokie, Illinois. During his tenure at Linn-Mar Community School District, Dr. Shepherd led the district in formulating a 10-year strategic plan, a restructuring plan, and a bond referendum campaign. So now Dr. Quintin is in Victoria ISD, which is in Texas, which I'm partial to, like I just shared with him since I'm from Texas. So welcome, Dr. Shepherd. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Really, truly my pleasure and my honor to be here and have this conversation today.
Good. So just quickly, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Angela Gehringer. I am the Director of Corporate Solutions here at Thoughtexchange. My job is to lead the corporate sales team to ensure that all of our corporate partners are utilizing our Thoughtexchange platform to the best of their abilities, that they're able to harness the human intelligence in their organizations through the use of Thoughtexchange. So now we're going to get to know you a little bit more personally, okay? Quintin, is that all right?
Sure.
Okay, so we know you professionally. We just read your bio. So now I'm going to ask you some quick questions in quick succession, okay? These are our 5-star questions, what we save for our 5-star leaders, and we certainly consider you one of our 5-star leaders. Okay, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. Beach or mountains?
Beach.
Okay, good thing. You're close to the beach now, right? Road trips or air travel?
Air travel.
Okay, lovely. In-person meetings or virtual meetings?
In person.
Good. Salty snacks or sweet tooth?
Salty. Salty.
Good. Now, Twitter or Instagram?
Twitter.
Oh, okay. That was really passionate. Twitter. Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, good. All right, so here at Thoughtexchange, one of our big focuses is on leadership development. We really feel like we're helping leaders become the kind of leaders that they want to be, leading organizations that they want to be a part of to stay relevant in a way that's, I think, necessary in today's market. And that leadership development really transcends vertical, whether it's education or corporate. It transcends your level within an organization, whether you're an individual contributor, a mid-level manager, or senior leader. It also, I think, just transcends industry. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. There's I think, paradigm shift that you're noticing in leadership. So I'd love for you to just kind of dive in right there and tell us what you're seeing in regards to this new leadership approach.
It's been fascinating to watch this happen over the last several years. And I've tried to be in it as a superintendent, as a leader for, almost 15 years now. But I've also tried to step back from time to time and reflect on what's happening. And really what I started to notice happening in a pretty profound way about 5, maybe 6 years ago was that so much of what we grew up with in leadership and what we read about and what we heard about and we discussed and talked about was relevant, but changing rather dramatically. And we were kind of pushed into this world of social media and pushed into this world of crowdsourcing and pushed into a world that a lot of us were trying to wrap our heads around. And it essentially came to me a few years ago that the movement away from transactional leadership and towards transformational leadership was really, really powerful, but it needed to be contextualized in this digital world that we live in. And I've come upon the realization, at least for me, from my own understanding, that there's at least 9 different places where I'm advocating there's just language we need to walk away from because it's become so archaic. It's actually working against us as leaders. And there's new language we need to start to adopt and use as part of our leadership profile and who it is that we want to become. And like you said, the way I say it is we want to become the best version of ourselves. And we want to set out to be the leaders that we wanted to be when we first started. And we realize there's tremendous power in doing that if we're willing to walk away from some paradigms and into new paradigms. And that's shaky, and it's scary, and it's vulnerable. And at the same time, it's energetic and powerful, and tremendous capacity to build the folks who we work with every day and the people who we're trying to serve every day. And so I'm on this personal mission, I guess. It's a leadership mission, and recognizing that this type of leadership is not for everyone. There are folks out there who are not ready for this, and that's perfectly fine. But there are other folks who are ready to step off into this void of the new leadership, and I'm calling it the sort of the leadership language we need. And so let's have that conversation. And so I'm eager and always excited to talk to other leaders who want to help define this new territory.
I love this. I think you're absolutely right. There is this upswell. I think we're seeing, with the popularity of Brene Brown, her new Netflix special and all of these things. I think it perfectly aligns with what you're describing, with what we see and we hold value in at our organization here at Thoughtexchange. And so I'm so glad to hear that this is a personal mission for you, because I think I speak for all of the leaders here listening today, and certainly for myself in saying that we recognize this shift that's coming, but where do we go? How do we do it? How do we contextualize it? And what does it look like in our practical day-to-day leadership style? So I love that we're starting this conversation today, because I think that there's a ton for us to learn together on this. So you mentioned a little bit about your 9 concepts of leadership. So I'd love if you could just kind of describe for us in broad terms what those are, what they look like, before we really dive into today's topic, which is, of course, moving from competent to compassionate leadership.
Well, that's one of them. And I think that's one of the foundational things that you have to sort of grasp, is this difference between competent to compassionate leadership. But, a couple of the others, I'll just talk about a couple of the others, is, moving away from engagement. And some of the folks listening today maybe have heard me talk about this, because I've spoken about this a lot, but moving away from engagement and buy-in. I'm officially done with those words. I no longer use them, and I encourage other people to stop saying those words too, because they're hurtful to the type of leadership that we want to embrace. I think the word that we're after is ownership. Engagement is engagement when it's convenient, and buy-in sort of presupposes that I'm selling you something. Ownership is totally different. It's a totally different mindset, and it's saying to the community, we're co-owners together, whoever the community is. In schools, sometimes our community might be our teachers, it might be our students, but obviously in the world of business, this is applicable too. Mm-hmm. And so how do you move from engagement to ownership? How do you move from openness? Everybody talks about openness, and it's a great thing, but I actually advocate, let's walk away from openness. Let's never use that word again, because openness doesn't work. Let's talk about radical transparency. And that's a different concept. It's a different way of thinking about being radically transparent with whoever it is that you're talking to, and recognizing, and you mentioned Brene Brown, that's that vulnerability piece. Mm-hmm. So as a leader, are you willing to embrace radical transparency and the vulnerability that comes with it? Recognizing that you're going to say to a group, I may not have all the answers, but I'm being radically transparent in what we're doing so that collectively we can solve these difficult issues. Another one that I think is incredibly powerful is moving from complicated decisions to complex decisions. And I like talking about this a lot too. There are complicated decisions that happen in every business and in every school that require certain expertise. And then there's complex issues that we face that you cannot solve these solutions. You cannot solve these things on your own. The complex problems that we face really are about finding the best thought and not necessarily the loudest voice. And so you can see that there's some language that when you put it in that paradigm, you can't help but say, you're right. Those words just no longer work for us. And competent is one of those words that I just don't think works. Compassionate. Now that's something that makes sense.
Yeah, I love this because I think for me, there's a lot of people out there that are probably going, okay, open, what? Not using openness? That is radical. And now you want us to use radical transparency. And really, what is the difference in definition there? And how can I make sure I'm doing one versus the other? And so I'd really like to kind of dive in right there. Let's talk about competency, compassion. Like, give me the definitions of those words so that as a leader, I can really effectively distinguish when I'm doing one versus the other.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, competence-based leadership sort of presupposes that there's a judge out there who's judging the work that we do. And so as leaders, if we're being judged on our competence, it is, did you get X, Y, or Z done? And it assumes that we're not actually working together. It's that somebody is judging the work that you've done. And as leaders, one of the things that's incumbent on all of us is that we work with the folks who are our followers, right? The folks who we're working with within our association. And again, if you start your conversations with the people who you work with in the form of competence, you did or did not do, then you're focusing on what you want from them. And this is something that we heard at a summit event in Austin. What do I want from you? And that, again, doesn't put us on the same page. And it's not really working together at the end of the day when you're focused on competence. Now, there are times and there are places where competence is important, but that very definition of competence-based is, I'm looking at the work that you've done and judging it, and let's have a conversation. What I want from you, as opposed to what I want for you. Now, if I engage that conversation, what I want for you, that's no longer about competence, that's about compassion. And if you look at the word compassion and you break it down, obviously the first three letters, that means together and with. So right out of the gate, we're talking about with. And passion, if you break that down, it actually means suffering, which I love that. I think that's why the word is so powerful, because if you think about somebody who's a compassionate leader, it's somebody who suffers with.
Mm-hmm.
And just, I kind of like to just pause and reflect on what that means. So are you willing to suffer with the people who you are leading? And suffering with them means standing shoulder to shoulder, or better yet, it means sitting with them so that when you stand, you're standing with them, right? And so compassion is to suffer with. So do you suffer with those folks who you're leading so that you can say, together we are trying to do X, Y, and Z? And again, you're asking folks to look at the work that you do and be compassionate with you, right? And suffer with you. And so for me in the school system, what I'm hopeful for, the type of environment where every leader can thrive, is when a school board says, we're willing to suffer with you through these decisions together. And a community is willing to come forward and say, we're willing to suffer with you through these decisions. And you can see now how radical transparency actually becomes fuel for that fire. It doesn't work against you, it works with you. Because if you're being radically transparent with your community that here's a really big, complex problem, not complicated, complex problem that I'm facing, and I need to suffer with you so that we can find a solution together, right? Now you've moved away from engagement and you've moved towards ownership. Mm-hmm. And you can see how some of the words that I threw out earlier, they all start to line up, and it's that new paradigm of leadership that is tremendously powerful.
One of the things that really bubbles up for me is that it is tremendously powerful. I mean, that question alone of like, are you willing as a leader to suffer with those around you, with those that you work with, that you lead? I think that it would require this paradigm shift would require a tremendous amount of self-reflection and self-awareness. So I'm curious to know that if we have been living in this other leadership paradigm for ages, and we move towards that, what are some ways that you would help to advise new leaders kind of embracing this paradigm shift to walk into that self-reflection and that self-awareness and be able to ask themselves a question like, am I willing to suffer with those that I'm near and those that I'm leading?
Well, I think it gets back to, you asked if it would be an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting. It's an in-person meeting, and it's the leadership part of you that, and I think I have to say this too. It does take some time as a leader to develop the the profile that you're really after, like who you really want to be. And there's a certain period of time, you could probably argue it's the 10-year rule, where it becomes less about success and more about significance. And I think that's like, that should hold meaning for all of us, is that you want to be a leader of significance. And really at the end of the day, it's to care about the people that you're leading. And every system that we're in, and I think this is true for business, it's true for industry, it's true for education. Every business we're in has been designed for the last 40, 50 years to be competence-based. So we will walk in the door every single day and competency will push up against us. Mm-hmm. Performance evaluations. I mean, you could go on for hours and hours and hours talking about all of this, the data and the assessment movements and all the things related to having real-time critical data, big data, you name it, it's all there, but it's all built around competence, and it's asking us to move away from compassion. And so you have to, like you said, be self-reflective and know that you're going to bump into this every day, but to start the conversation with the person first. And if you put that person first and you really deeply care about what you want for them, I want for them to feel valued. I want for them to feel respected. I want for them to feel powerful. I want for them to, whatever it is, then that draws you back into compassionate-based leadership. And for me, this was not something that happened overnight. I didn't just wake up one day and say, okay, now I'm going to try to be a compassionate leader. Like, this has been a decade in the making for me, and I still screw it up on a regular basis, probably a dozen times a day at least. But I feel like I'm getting closer and closer to the leader that I want to be. And that's what got me to originally start talking about this with other folks and saying, we need to be doing this together, all of us, and encouraging each other to do better and to become the best version of ourselves and to become the type of leader that we want to be. And that's why I'm actively looking for more people to talk to in this field, in this space, so that we can push on each other and grow with each other.
That's great, Quintin. Well, the good news is I think you've found a welcoming community to have those discussions with. And I do just really appreciate pointing out the grace involved in that with yourself and with those around you as you move through this paradigm shift. I think a lot of times, because we have this broken record of competent leadership in our heads that we've been kind of, we've grown up with. I think that just recognizing that, and having grace with ourselves and with those surrounding us, I think is an important point. So I appreciate you pointing that out. I do want to take just a second to talk about the really powerful discussion that's happening in the webinar chat. I think that there are a number of thoughts in here that I want us to dive into when we get to the exchange too. So Quintin, help me when we get there and we start talking about these things, that we can start, we can dive into this feedback as well as the thoughts that come up in the exchange.
Sure.
Okay, so I would love to talk to you about how you're using this practically in your day-to-day leadership. You know, you talk about your successes and your failures in doing it. Is there some kind of specific examples that you can give us where you've really been able to like insert compassion versus competence?
Sure. I can, think of an example not too long ago where we actually used this tool, and we were talking about creating a profile for the next leader who was gonna move on, and we wanted to create a profile for the next leader. And in a conversation with this leader who was moving to a different position in our district, and she talked about how putting out an exchange, asking for the leadership traits and characteristics that the school was looking for, was a little bit scary, right? And a little bit hard, because it's easy to look at that feedback and say, what was it that I was not doing as a leader? Or what was it that I was not accomplishing as a leader? Or what didn't happen on my watch, right? And to judge yourself. And it's that moment right then and there that's the leadership opportunity. So it was that opportunity when I was talking to her to say, you have to take a pause on that and recognize that that's competence coming out. That's competence where you're judging yourself and you're thinking that other people are judging you, but that's not really the world I want you to live in. I want you to live in the world of suffering with the teachers in this particular school, which is to recognize that it is what they need. It is what the organization needs to move forward. So it's okay to embrace that compassionate leadership. And the first step to, I think, effective compassionate leadership And I'll be honest, I stole this from a conversation I had with Dave McLeod at Thoughtexchange, and he said, in order to really do this well, and this is what he was reflecting back to me, you have to first be able to forgive yourself. And we hear that echoed in Brene Brown and what she talks about with vulnerability as well. And it's this recognition that you don't have to judge yourself on your competence as a leader either. You can embrace compassion as a leader, and that means forgiving yourself. And it's okay because I'm not judging you. So you don't have to judge yourself either.
That's so powerful. I love that. Yes, Dave, I think the two of you guys, it would be great to have you talk together because, or at least to be a fly on the wall while you did, because this is such powerful stuff. Before we dive into the exchange, which we're about to start, Quintin, one of the things I'd really like to chat with you about is what can the leaders who are watching today, the attendees that are watching today, what are some like quick tips and tricks that they can start doing immediately as soon as this virtual event is over to ensure that they are inserting compassion into their leadership?
I think just thinking about the words that we use, if nothing else, like truly early on when I was really starting to embrace this paradigm shift that was happening in leadership, I have, this probably won't work on video webinar, but I have these little Post-it notes that I keep on my desk from time to time. And I would put these little Post-it notes on my desk that only I could see that would remind me about the language that I used and being reflective about the language that I used. And they were my mental reminders about the type of language that I wanted to use when I was having interactions with people, because that's where it really matters. And then committing to this notion that I would use this language, but not just in meanings and not just on a surface level, but that I had to believe it and I had to mean it. And so you make small commitments like that, you make larger commitments. Mm-hmm. I made a commitment when I first came here to Victoria, and I've told my senior cabinet this, but I made a commitment that for at least the first 6 months, I wouldn't ask anything what I wanted from them until they knew that my focus was on them as people, and recognizing that what they needed and what they wanted was a leader who wanted to be connected with them, who wanted to suffer with them. And so I made a conscientious effort not to do that. And that's hard as a leader because we're inclined to do stuff right away. We're going to jump right in and we're going to do stuff. But I think I think my response to you is it's all about setting little goals, those daily goals, but then set a few big goals too and say, this is one thing I'm going to stop doing. I'm going to stop X, Y, or Z, and making small steps. And you'll realize very quickly that there's a cultural phenomenon that will happen in your organization, and it can feed off of itself. Like I said, this notion of competence to compassionate leadership is just the first step in a what I've come to realize is a multi-step process of transforming into the leader that you want to be.
That's lovely. I think, my big takeaway from that, Quintin, is change your language. It'll change your leadership. It'll change your life. And that I think is really something that I can hold on to as a leader, and I'm hopeful that that the leaders watching today can hold on to as a big takeaway from today. Okay, so now,
hey, can I say one thing about I'm looking at a little bit of the webinar chat. I'm going to jump right in and say one thing about the webinar chat.
Oh my God, don't let me stop you. Go, go, go.
I love the whole thing about decision and fear being paralyzed. I don't think that people fear being wrong. They don't. People inherently don't fear being wrong. They fear being judged. Mm-hmm. I think that's it. And it gets back to this notion of competence. That's what keeps us from so often moving forward in education and making the change that we want to make, or in any industry, frankly, is that when people are afraid of being judged, they won't take big, bold action. Yeah. It's not that people fear being wrong. They fear being judged.
That's lovely. And an important distinction, I think. Anything else you want to address in here before we dive into the exchange?
No.
Sure?
No, go for it. Okay,
so you can use the QR code here you see on the screen. If you've got an iPhone, open up your camera, scroll in. It will have a pop-down, a pop-up thing that you need to just click on. It'll take you right into the exchange. Or if you have an Android, you can also go to thoughtexchange.com/join and enter this 9-digit code. You can do that to get into the exchange, or Amelia is going to drop the link in the chat so that you can join the exchange on your desktop. You should know that the question we're asking today is, what thoughts or questions you have about taking your leadership from competent to compassionate. So get in there, star, share, discover, all that good stuff in this exchange. I want to hear all your thoughts, your questions, your feedback for Quintin so he can dive in the second part of this virtual event. In order for you to do that, I'm going to need to be quiet so you have some brain space to do that. So I'm going to do that, maybe a little bit awkward, but just know that I'm going to rejoin you and we'll start this conversation once you've gotten a chance to share, star, and discover. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see all the ways that you all are interacting with one another while you're in there starring. Remember, this is where we say the magic happens, right? This is when you're thinking critically about all of the thoughts and opinions and perspectives of the other people within this exchange. We like to say we're creating empathy, of course, and considering others' points of views. Please share and then star between 20 to 30 thoughts. I think that's a good rule of thumb, so that way we can make sure everybody has some equal consideration. I'm curious to know, Quintin, have you ever used an exchange in a live setting like this and shown the thought graph so that everyone can see how they're interacting with one another?
Yes.
And was it pretty powerful for them?
Yes, almost always the same, especially if you show this after the exchange, but just go show folks how the ideas came about and how we all organized around the ideas, especially around larger exchanges where you've had 200, 300, 400, 500 people. What inevitably happens is you see some people in the middle to start with, and then pretty soon the ideas, kind of like we're starting to see here, the ideas start to draw towards the center. And we actually had a local reporter who visited one of our meetings, and she was in the room as we were showing this happening, and she was talking with me, and we were talking about this, and she said it's sort of like watching a brain think. It's a social brain right now. It's learning from itself, right, and going in tangents. At first it sort of looks like I like how my board president described it, like a beehive. Like right. The bees are going out and collecting information and coming back and putting it in. And it's some version on that theme that like, this is the social organization of learning. And it's actually watching it happen. It's tremendously powerful. And almost always, if you show it in a group, everybody stops talking and starts watching that happen, which is really kind of cool.
I know. I feel maybe I've done this prematurely while people are still starring, because you're right. It is, I think, intoxicating to see, oh, I'm engaging with them, and then they stop engaging. So yes, continue right. Engaging, and then in a couple of minutes we'll dive right into these top thoughts. Okay, let's dive in. And like I said, don't let me forget. We'll take a peek back at that chat too. But I'm hopeful some people have shared some of these same thoughts that they shared in the chat into the exchange. So hopefully we'll also be able to address those either way. So let's start here at the top. I'm going to refresh it one more time just to ensure that we've gotten all things considered. So what are the keywords or language I should be moving away from? And what are the keywords or language I should be moving to? It is the building blocks or foundation of becoming a compassionate leader. This is great. I think, you touched on this. Before we dive into this question, I do want to say we are anticipating doing a series of these, right, Quintin? This is just the tip of the iceberg. And so a lot of the language that you're using today, I think, are keys. But as we continue to meet together and talk about each of these different competencies, no pun intended, then we can dive into this language, I think, even at a deeper level.
Absolutely. I'll touch on a few, and I'll try to, I noticed a few thoughts in here, so I'll try to connect a few of the thoughts as I was reading through them as well about like, isn't there still an HR function to the work that we do? Like, don't you still have to evaluate employees, and how do I talk to my superiors? And I saw 2 or 3 comments related to that. So I'll tie that into this question about key language. I think one of the key pieces to that is there's a real difference. And I'm gonna go somewhere you don't think I'm gonna go. I'm gonna talk about my own children for a minute. Okay? And what I do not want from my children is an excuse. Mm-hmm. Like, if the trash didn't get taken out, the last thing any parent wants is an excuse. What I would like from my children is an explanation. Those are 2 very different things, right? And so if I'm a supervisor, back to this HR function, there's a huge paradigm shift between excuse versus explain. You see, excuse is competence. Explain is compassion. And it's so small. It seems so infinitesimally small, but so important. You know, another word that's a big transition for us is the difference between accountability, that's competence, versus responsibility, that's compassion. You see, I think of it like this. It's a formula. Something plus something equals something. And then somebody along the way says, you're not doing your job, so we need to hold you, Mr. CEO, accountable. We need to hold you, Ms. Principal, accountable. That's the equation in competence world. In compassion world, it's that the equation would read something plus responsibility plus whatever, and you don't need the accountability piece on the end. Because at the end of the day, if I'm responsible for the education of every student in Victoria ISD, then you don't need to hold me accountable for that because I'm already holding myself responsible, right? And so again, a really small word, accountability to responsibility is a paradigm shift for everyone. Another one that I've wrote about on LinkedIn and talk about when I get the opportunity is let's never use the word soft skills again. These things that we're talking about right now, these are not soft skills. These are power skills. These are the skills that every person needs to be successful. There's nothing soft about them. These are the power skills that kids need now, that every employee needs to be successful, that every leader needs to be successful. One more, and then we'll maybe move on to the next one. But a big one for me is, can we all please stop talking about the work-life balance? I don't ever want to hear about the work-life balance ever again, but let's commit to the life-work balance.
Okay, tell me more.
Let's put life first. Let's put people first. Let's not put work first. I mean, to assume that we're going to have a work-life balance assumes that work is priority in everyone's life. And that shouldn't be true for anyone, in my opinion. A work-life balance assumes that the thing that's topmost on my mind is the work that's being done. My reality is that it's a life-work balance that we all need to embrace. And so how do you do that? How do you embrace that there's a life-work balance? It has to do with, and that's conceptual. What does it mean on a practical level? On a practical level, it means that I'm not going to email people when we leave work. I'm gonna try to encourage people to have a life outside of it and to engage in family time and appreciate family time. I read these things in Fast Company and Inc. magazine and Business Insider that says that there's these CEOs that wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and bang out email for an hour and a half, but the expectation is that somebody's going to respond back to you. And that's just the world we live in. So I think having a sense of human decency and putting life first, that transforms culture with a capital C.
Yeah. I'm going to be a little vulnerable here. I am so guilty of what you're describing in these email things. Like like you're saying this and I'm thinking, oh gosh, I'm doing this. And I think you're right. It's like, you talked about, little tiny changes that you can make. And I think baby steps make miracles, right? And what you're saying is like, this is a little thing that I can do as a leader in an organization to, I think, shift a culture. And I'm hopeful that everyone listening today can take these practical things, because what you're saying, like you said, the power skills, that I think that just even that shift of perception for the way that we perceive these skills is so vitally important for the way that we talk about them, the way that we value them as an organization, and for ourselves and for the people surrounding us. So I just really appreciate that. Okay.
Well, especially as leaders, because
Absolutely.
as leaders, if we're emailing the folks who are our followers, there's an implied demand that you need to be working when I'm working.
Right.
And so we have to be conscientious of that.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. I'm going to take that one. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. How can we change the culture of our organization to be more compassionate, especially when others like the competent approach? I think this is a really great question, and I'd love to know your take on it.
Yeah, I think being upfront right away, like establishing yourself as that leader, as the person who you are and who you're trying to be. I think it's in some ways it's easier to start in an organization and say, this is who I am as a leader. These are my leadership beliefs, and this is who I am and what I stand for. I think it's a little bit harder when you're already in an organization and trying to redefine yourself. But again, it goes back to vulnerability. I think honestly having a conversation with the people who you're closest to and saying, this is my personal leadership journey. This is where I'm at right now. And I'm trying to move from competence to compassion-based leadership. This is what it means for me. This is how I want to be able to interact with people. It's the way I want to make decisions. And so I need your help and soliciting help from folks and encouraging them to tell you when you don't do it right. And I think the people who, somebody wrote in the comment section, it's okay to use the word love. The people who love you will tell you that. They will give you that honest feedback and say, this just didn't work for us. This just didn't work for you. And that's okay to get that feedback. Getting that feedback is a decidedly good thing because it does mean you're in that suffer with mode.
Yeah, I love that. We talked about name one concrete way to measure how successful you are. Oh, we didn't talk about this. How do you measure your success on moving and shifting in this way from competent to compassion?
Yeah, well, see, measuring it would be that value judgment, right? Like I'm after it's the move from climate to culture.
Okay.
And you can't measure culture. Culture is that intangible thing. I mean, there's ways to assess, the overall climate surveys and what have you, and that's a good way to start to get at it. But the culture with a capital C, that's the soil, right? We hear about the tending the soil to make sure that the seeds can grow, and if you're tending the soil, then you're tending the culture. And measuring that comes in small ways, but really it's the feeling as the leader that you're trying to create. And you just know it. You know it when you're doing it well, and you know it when you're not doing it well. People will tell you if you're not doing it well. And if you're doing it well, they will let you know.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you're right. I think you see lots of symptoms of culture, but it's difficult to measure it. So, people stick around, people are happy, people like their jobs, they're engaged, things like this. These are ways that you could, I think, inadvertently measure it, but really it's a feeling. It's something that in your heart, whether or not you're doing it well or not. What are your ideas of how to develop compassion when we talked about this a bit. How do we effectively balance competency and compassion? Can we have compassion for a team member who's struggling, but if they're not performing due to incompetence, where do we draw the line? Oh, this is a good question. Talk to me a little bit about your take on this.
Yeah, that's you're getting at the notion of whether or not someone is unwilling or unable, and that's important. But again, I guess the assumption is that you're not surprising them. Right? If you're really suffering with them at every step along the path, then both, it's not a surprise, right? You're being transparent. You're being as transparent as possible about where you're seeing them struggle and how can I help you? And this is where I see you struggle and I want you to be successful. So how can I help you? And recognizing that you're getting into that notion of competence, and that's okay. There's still parts of our job that are unavoidable. Like you just have to go there. But I think if you're committed to radical transparency, if you're committed to crucial accountability, we've talked about, you've read the books hopefully on crucial accountability and crucial conversations and all that other stuff. And we read this stuff in leadership all the time and we say, yeah, but how do I apply it? And I think it's always coming back to, I'm going to put this person first. I'm not going to surprise them. I want for them to feel successful. And in order to do so, they need to know where it's not happening and how it's not getting done. And trying to stay on the compassion side of the equation, trying to keep in your own heart that you don't want to be on the accountability side, holding them accountable for what's not being done. Because if we're focused on their accountability, then what it means is that we're not really focused on their sense of responsibility.
Okay.
And so it's always just sort of putting the brakes on when we feel ourselves going into the world of competence and saying, have I looked at this from a responsibility standpoint? Have I looked at this from an explanation versus an excuse standpoint? Have I looked at this from, this is what I want for them as opposed to what I want from them, right? And just forcing ourselves to use the new language, the new paradigm from every angle, and it works.
That's
More
great.
often than not, it works.
I love that. Okay, well, I'm going to do one final one before we wrap up today. Quinn, what are some of the words you've written on the Post-its? This one really stood out for me because I think that this is like inquiring minds want to know. So
Like the secret sauce, if there is it. I think it's different. I think it's different for everyone. Largely, to be honest, it depends on the book that I'm reading at the time, because they're changing in and out, right? They're always changing in and out. But the ones that have stood at the top of mind, probably no surprise to anybody, suffering. Suffering is just one that felt real to me.
mm-hmm.
I sort of redefined how I thought about teamwork. So team stood foremost for a long time. Beginner stood for a long time, keeping a beginner's heart. When I was in my Brene Brown phase, it was all about vulnerability, exposure.
Mm-hmm.
Those were a lot of responsibility. I talked about that responsibility, so that I would stay away from accountability. Like, that was a hard one for me. That was a really hard one for me in education, because accountability. How are the students doing? How are the students doing? How are the teachers doing? How are the schools doing? That's all about accountability. And part of my big revolutionary moment, my light bulb moment, was walk away from accountability and own responsibility. If I own that sphere, if I own that language with my parents, with my teachers, with my students, it will help me push back against accountability. So that was a big one for me, is responsibility, so that it wouldn't fall into accountability. Ownership, radical transparency. I wrote that one a lot. Radical transparency. Just staying committed to it. In fact, I'll tell you a big secret about a lot of these words. We have a board table, like so many places. You have a board room with a board table, and we have this little ledge that sits in front of us at the board table, and it's so we could put the names on the front side of that. But what we had put on the back side of that only the board members and I can see, and here it is, the great big secret, we put some of those phrases on the back of every one of our placards that face the audience. So the audience doesn't see it, but we all have these words on the backside facing us.
I love that.
So that we're seeing it all the time in our conversations. And it's a constant reminder for us. And I had that done when I first came here to Victoria, just as a reminder to me. And I did it for myself, but I also did it for our board, that we're going to keep this top of mind, those things that are the culture we're trying to build.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things I do want to dive into is like what are the books you're reading right now, but we'll save that for the next time. But I really do just appreciate this time that we've had together today, Quintin. It's been so profound, I think, for me, and I think I speak for all the attendees too. I'm thrilled at the idea of continuing this conversation, because I do think so much of what you're saying is applicable to both leaders in corporations and leaders in education, really any leader. Even the idea of taking away accountability. You're not accountable just for the numbers, right? In your organization, you're responsible for the numbers. I think anyone in the corporate side can certainly relate to that, and that same lesson in the same way. I'm curious to know, I'm just going to put a pin in it because we are already over time. Do you have anything you'd like to share? Any final words you'd like to share today, Quintin, before we end? We're going to, of course, follow up with the results of the exchange and anything like that. But any other words of wisdom before we part today?
No, just gratitude for everybody taking the time today to be a part of the conversation. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts as well. It means a lot to me.
Thank you so much. I feel the same way. I'm overcome with gratitude to have you today. As a reminder, we're going to keep this conversation going. You'll get a follow-up email from me, everyone, all the attendees, with the results from the exchange. You'll also have my email address in case you want to talk more about leadership development or Thoughtexchange. I think you've certainly challenged all of us, Quintin, to what I'd like to say is kind of leader up. It's like level up in our leadership. And so I would just challenge all of us today to go out and try to leader up based off this conversation today.
There you go. Be the best version of yourself, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.